This segment is about accreditation as an outcome. Now, it's actually one of a two-part set of videos. The other video is about process, and they're kind of inseparable, so you're going to want to watch both of them. I'm going to use something of a roundabout way to explain accreditation as an outcome, but go through it and bear with me, because when we're finished, if you understand it and you've done it, you'll actually have made some progress as well in completing a chunk of the self-study report or understanding what you need for that self-study report. So in effect, in order to understand the outcome, you have to be able to understand that you're telling a story. You're telling a story to your stakeholders, including accreditors. And how do you tell the story? What's the story that you're telling? Because accreditation is about validating that story. You're making some promises. You're making some claims to a variety of stakeholders. And fundamentally, what accreditation is doing is saying, we believe your story. So how do you do that? And part of it that we'll talk about as well is you have to be able to document that story. What's the evidence on which you have drawn this story? Because this is not a fictional story, this is nonfiction. So what's the evidence that people have to say, yeah, this makes sense, it holds together, there's a real story? We'll demonstrate here one way of doing that. There are certainly others. Now, feel free to stop. In fact, I'm going to ask you to stop this video at one point to do a little exercise. At any point, you can stop it, look at the slides, download the slides. They come with notes that have a lot more detail. You should certainly send at least one person to the Accreditation Institute if you're considering initial accreditation or reaccreditation, because at the Accreditation Institute, which is associated with NASPAA's annual meeting, that's where you'll have an opportunity to practice the tools and concepts that we're talking about in these videos. So let's start with this question: who cares about your program? To really understand accreditation, then it helps to begin with this question. What's the value that your program provides, and to whom? Which is to say, who cares about your program? So here's what I'm going to ask you to pause the video and take 5 minutes after I give you some instructions. I want you to take a sheet of paper, draw a line down the center. On the left side, you should put a list of all of the people who are impacted by your program, who care about your program. You know, some are obvious and some are less obvious. Students, faculty, employers, partners that you work with within the university or within the community. Whatever it is, whoever you can think of that's a member of a group that cares about your program, put that on the left side of the sheet of paper. And on the right side, write out, why do they care? What's their reason for caring about the success or failure of your program? Because if accreditation is asking about and validating the claims and promises that you're making to these stakeholders, then you ought to be able to explain why you're making those promises and claims. So take 5 minutes and do that. The takeaways from this exercise are several. They ought to include one, that the history of your program matters. Where it started, how it started, why it started, history matters. How you got to where you are today, why these various stakeholders are engaged in the way they are, depends to some extent on how your whole program started. Another takeaway is that you can't be assured that your program will continue forever. Its sustainability depends on its adaptability, it depends on the availability of resources. It requires ongoing attention and support. Programs tend to serve identifiable constituencies and regions. That's another thing that you should realize by going through this exercise when you listed all those stakeholders. Are they geographic regions? Why are they your stakeholders? And then different stakeholders are going to be engaged with your program in different ways and need different kinds of information on which to base their decisions about whether and how to engage in your program. So, in effect, what we want you to do in this process is to think about who are the stakeholders, what's the information that they need, and how are you going to engage them. This is a process that's actually called mapping the environment of your program. So just as an example, your students, they're clearly a stakeholder. Why are they coming to your program and not a competing program? What do they want to know? They want to know about the quality of your faculty. They probably want to know something about the students they're going to be in classes with, who they're going to be career associates with for the rest of their lives. There's a variety. They want to know what your program requirements are. These are all things that prospective students want to know. Once they get there, how are you going to engage them? Well, some things you take for granted. You're going to want them to come to class. You're going to want them to do the work you ask them to do as learning exercises. You're going to want them to potentially do an internship. You're going to want them to be looking for employment. You're going to want them to engage in student government, student committees, and student activities. What information do they need to make those decisions about whether to do that? What about employers? Employers are going to want to know about the competencies your students have because they want to hire them. They're going to want to know about the expertise of your faculty because they may want to engage your faculty as consultants or in other ways. But how will you engage employers? Well, you want the employers to employ your graduates. You want them to host your interns. But you might also invite them to be guest speakers. You might also encourage them to serve on advisory committees to your program to help you develop your curriculum or decide upon new initiatives. And so it goes that you go through all of these stakeholders and you say, how do I actually engage these folks? And what's the information they need that might get them excited or interested in being engaged? So you sort of picture your program like in the hub of a wheel with the spokes coming out. At the end of each spoke is a different stakeholder group, and they're sometimes interrelated. You're mapping your program. And we'll give you a resource for doing more of that. Now, you take that map and you have to now tell the story of your program. Try and explain the story of your program. That is, where did all these stakeholders come from? How do they get engaged? Why do they get engaged? You know, the simplest way to tell a story is to go to a famous Rudyard Kipling poem that basically says, I keep 6 honest serving men. They taught me all I knew. Their names are what and why and when and how and where and who. If you answer those questions, you're essentially telling a story. The beginning, a middle, and an end. The basics of gathering information to tell your story to accreditors or to anyone lie in this set of questions. You know, so who? I mean, who started the program? Why did they start the program? What was the process that they used for creating that program? What were the factors that influenced them in starting the program? If you answer the first 5 W's, in effect, even where, why is the program housed where it is as opposed to somewhere else, even at why not at another institution? If you answer those 5 W's, you're getting toward the how you run your program, what makes it distinctive from all these other programs. And that's a really key point in terms of understanding your mission that might be a distinctive mission compared to other programs. At the same time, your program is going to go through change. No program is static. They always change because their stakeholders change, their stakeholders' needs change, their environment changes. So you're going to be making changes over time. NASPAA understands that, COPRA understands that, that's life. So how are those changes consistent with this mission, what it is that makes you distinctive and particularly valuable to your stakeholders? What was the evidence you used every time you had to make a change about faculty, staff, program, curriculum, whatever it is? So in effect, you have to sort of repeat the basics of information gathering for major changes that you've made in the history of your program that explains how you got to where you are now. So this repeats an important point about accreditation has a lot to do with documentation. There are decisions you make, even if you're a small group and you make decisions over coffee once a week. For accreditation purposes, you have to document that. You have to collect evidence. What kinds of evidence? Well, there should be faculty minutes of faculty meetings. There should be reports from committees that are formed to make decisions. There may be university analyses of your program. Whatever that documentation is, could include syllabi, it can include course evaluations, any assessment materials that you use, records of decisions that you've made, whether you keep them in electronic format or hard copy. This is information that you arguably are making decisions based upon, and your stakeholders are going to want to see or have access to some of that information. And of course, the accreditation body needs to know that you're using the information to make evidence-based decisions. So if you've collected the information and you've answered all these questions to tell your story, then you really have the basis for accreditation. And what is accreditation as an outcome? It's an assurance to your stakeholders that the claims and promises that you're making are valid and correct and accurate. I mean, another outcome is your program will have improved as a result of the process. So NASPAA's accreditation process is an independent assessment to help your stakeholders justify the claims that you're making. And in fact, if you've gone through the process I just described and explained your history and told your story, and your story includes how you continue to improve, you've essentially completed a big chunk, well, at least a chunk, of the self-study report as it's required. Remember that this is not just about accreditation. This is about improving public service.